Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 10, Day 4. Today's journal, I'd like for you to talk about what types of things did Hitler do to encourage war in Europe. All right, we talked about quite a few things in Day 3, various things about the Jews. We talked about some things prior to that, talked about Hitler with Mein Kampf. Just think about some of those things. Do the best you can to find as many examples as you can of why he was encouraging war in Europe. Now, today we're going to be talking about World War II again, obviously, and we're going to be talking about America entering the war. Now, today's essential question: what factors encouraged the fighting between the Allied and the Axis powers? Now, remember we were talking about that the United States was trying to isolate. Three things had changed our isolationist perspectives, and now we're moving towards a policy of interventionism, which is intervening or getting involved in. First thing was the German invasion of France. It fell in less than 5 weeks, which made us very nervous because if France could fall that fast, the only thing standing between us and them was England. The rescue of Allied forces at Dunkirk, which essentially we'd seen that the French forces were forced completely out of the country, as well as any of the Allied forces who were there fighting, and the acceptance of bases for destroyers to deal with the United Kingdom helped us get involved as well. So essentially what we said was if they would give us a base in the United Kingdom, we would give them 50 ships in exchange, basically lease the ships to them. It also helped that Roosevelt won the election in 1940. Many people didn't feel it was a good time to change leaders, especially that they felt like he had been very successful during the war, and he will become the first president to serve as a third term. Now, the U.S. was growing closer to war during this time. FDR wanted to create an arsenal of democracy. It was very clear that FDR realized we did not need to stay isolated or away from the war any longer. Hitler had invaded Stalin's USSR, so now Russia and Germany are fighting now because Hitler's been so successful in Europe. Now he can turn his attention to Russia. FDR wanted to send aid to the communist USSR because he felt like if Russia fell, it would only strengthen Hitler's power in Europe and Asia. And so what he's going to do is use the Lend-Lease Act, and he's going to start lending and leasing weapons and ships and vehicles to any country that was considered vital to the defense of the United States. That's how he justified the fact that he was helping a communist nation. And so the big thing that he sent was Studebaker trucks that helped move troops across Russia, especially its rough terrain and the rough weather there. The problem was it did not apply to the Neutrality Act because the weapons were just on loan. Okay, so remember the Neutrality Act said they could not sell weapons. Okay, and then you had the cash carry system where they had to buy with cash and carry it on their ships. Well, the way he said this is they were lending and leasing the vehicles and weapons. They weren't technically selling them. So it's kind of like something in the fine print. They sent over $50 billion worth of supplies, and it was loan your neighbor a hose to put out a fire, and the fire being Nazi Germany. Now, in June of 1941, Hitler launches an invasion on the Soviet Union. In August of 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill meet aboard the HMS Prince of Wales, and they form the Atlantic Charter, which was an agreement committing Churchill and Roosevelt to the shared goal of opposing Hitler and his allies. So even in August of 1941, Roosevelt was already getting us in the middle of this war, months before anything happens with Pearl Harbor. There also was this endorsement of free trade, disarming Germany after the war, a collective security where they help protect each other, and a post-World War free from fear and want. Now, the problem is that while all this is going on, tensions between the United States and Japan are rising. In July of 1940, the Export Control Act was passed. It gave Roosevelt the power to restrict the sale of strategic materials to other nations. And so what they were trying to do is restrict some of the sales, some of their oil and things of that nature, because they didn't want to lose the supplies that they needed in case they got into a war with Germany, which they were headed towards. 1941, Roosevelt began sending Lend-Lease aid to China, which also upsets Japan because obviously Japan and China are very much at war at this point. Japan has invaded Manchuria, as well as they're trying to take parts of China. And so Roosevelt freezes all of Japan's assets in America and reduces the oil being shipped to Japan, which hurts their war effort. Now, it's obvious that this plan was that their plan to attack the United States was already in preparation long before that happened, but that kind of speeds up the process of that they are very upset at the United States. So Japan decides to seize British and Dutch territory in Southeast Asia and seize the Philippines. Remember, we had quite a bit of a hand in the Philippines up to this point. The Japanese also decided to attack Pearl Harbor, so the U.S. would have no fleet in the Pacific, which would keep them from stopping the United States from re-seizing any resources from South or East Asia. So essentially what they're trying to do is keep the United States from coming and bothering them by attacking Pearl Harbor. So on December 7, 1941, Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor is going to lead America to give up this policy of isolationism. They sank 21 ships, 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 6 others. 188 planes were destroyed and 2,400 Americans were killed. And then another 1,178 were injured. FDR is noted as saying it was a date which will live in infamy. And essentially, it drags us out of our isolationist policy, and we're going to begin intervening in the rest of the world's fights. 1941, December 8th, the U.S. declares war on Japan. December 11th, we declared war on Germany and Italy. Actually, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, which caused us to have to join in that front as well. All right, so here you can see the path that the Japanese took. And essentially, we lost them on radar, but there was information to say that we were going to be attacked. Magic, which was the name of the code that we had, the Japanese diplomatic code, it had given us basically the code that they were going to attack. Instructions to once and for all break off negotiations were at 1 p.m. on the 7th, your time. And this drafted message went to the Philippines, Panama, Hawaii, and San Francisco. Unfortunately, Hawaii's message were delayed because of weather, and was the actual message that they had broken that they were trying to send to Hawaii was finally received 2 hours after the attack was already over. Okay, and I'll let you read this. This is basically Roosevelt's speech, and just something that's really interesting to read. I always like seeing some of these War Times articles. The big thing here is that they awoke a sleeping giant. During the war, American workers were twice as productive as German workers, 5 times more productive than Japanese workers. And the U.S. is going to expand its war production before the Japanese attack to provide weapons to Lend-Lease, which is going to help us in the Pacific. Okay, and since the attack on Pearl Harbor, 200,000 companies had switched to war production. So what happens is Japan attacking us actually probably saved our country from sitting around doing nothing, because it allowed us to grow, and it forced us into this war production effort. These war industries like automobiles, and they began producing trucks, jeeps, tanks. Henry Ford converted his factories from making Model Ts to B-24s, and the automotive industry is going to produce nearly 1/3 of all the military equipment during the war. Military ships were welded instead of riveted, which also made a big difference, making them cheaper and harder to sink, and allowed us to produce ships at a much more rapid pace. So we'll continue talking about this more, but for now, here's your vocabulary. If you need anything else, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.